Eleanor Ellie Sullivan gripped the steering wheel of her weathered pickup truck as it bumped along the dusty rural road. Beside her, Rusty, her faithful 12-year-old retriever mix, pressed his graying muzzle against the half-open window, taking in the Montana autumn air with deep, appreciative sniffs. The October sun cast long shadows across the rolling landscape, painting the fields in warm amber hues. At 52, Ellie had learned to appreciate these moments of quiet beauty, these small mercies that punctuated a life that hadn't always been kind. "Well, old boy," she said to Rusty, reaching over to scratch behind his ears, "this is it, our big chance." As they crested the final hill, the old Harper farmhouse came into view, a weathered two-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. To most, it would look like a hopeless case, but Ellie saw potential where others saw ruin. It was a talent she'd honed from necessity, one that had carried her through the darkest periods of her life. 15 years ago, her husband had walked out on her and their 12-year-old daughter, Melissa, leaving nothing but bills and broken promises. The memory still stung. The bruises he'd left, both visible and invisible, had taken years to fade. Some never had. But adversity had forged Ellie into something stronger. She'd built her small real estate development business from nothing, scraping together clients and investors while raising Melissa alone. Now her daughter was 27, working as a graphic designer in Seattle, building her own life. And Ellie was here, about to embark on the biggest project of her career. The Harper property was 30 acres of prime land just outside the growing town of Pinewood, Montana. If she could transform it into the residential community she envisioned, it would establish her business permanently, create financial security she'd never known, and finally prove to herself and everyone else that Eleanor Sullivan was a force to be reckoned with. "Miss Sullivan?" A man in a hard hat approached as she parked near a cluster of construction equipment. "I'm Dave, foreman of the demolition crew. We're all set to start whenever you give the word." "Perfect," Ellie nodded, stepping out of the truck. Rusty jumped down after her, immediately beginning to explore his new surroundings. "Let's do a final walkthrough of the property first." The farmhouse was exactly what she'd expected. Rotten wood, collapsing roof, foundation crumbling after decades of neglect. As they circled to the back of the structure, Rusty suddenly froze, his ears perked forward. A low growl rumbled from his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ellie asked, following his gaze to an unremarkable patch of wild grass behind the house. "We can start with the main structure," Dave was saying, "then clear out these old outbuildings and level the land for the—" Rusty's bark cut him off, sharp, insistent warning. The dog raced to the patch of grass and began pawing frantically at the earth. "Never seen him act like this," Ellie frowned, walking over. "He's usually so calm." "Probably smells a gopher or something," Dave shrugged, but joined her nonetheless. "Let's get started with the house," Ellie decided, gently pulling Rusty away. "We can check this area later." 2 hours later, as the demolition of the farmhouse began, Ellie found herself drawn back to the spot that had agitated Rusty. The dog had refused to leave the area, continuing to sniff and paw at the ground with unusual determination. "Dave," she called, "can we bring the backhoe over here for a minute? I want to check something." Dave looked skeptical but nodded to the operator. "Ladies' orders. Bring it around." The powerful machine lumbered over, its giant steel teeth hovering above the patch of grass that had so captivated Rusty. "Just dig down a couple of feet," Ellie instructed. "Carefully." The operator nodded and began to scrape away the topsoil. 6 inches down, a foot, 2 feet, nothing unusual. Just as Ellie was about to call it off, the backhoe's blade struck something with a resounding clang that sent vibrations through the machine, killing its engine instantly. "What the hell?" Dave muttered, stepping forward. The operator climbed down from the cabin, clearly shaken. Hit something solid. Metal, I think. Definitely not rock. Ellie and Dave approached the shallow excavation. As the dust settled, what emerged left them both speechless, buried 4 feet below the surface, concealed under packed earth and wild grass, was a door. Not wood, not a cellar entrance. A massive steel door, seamless, with a sophisticated locking mechanism that looked military grade. "Miss Sullivan," Dave said slowly, "that wasn't in the property survey." Before Ellie could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew her attention. A weathered blue truck pulled up the dirt road, moving fast enough to kick up a cloud of dust. It skidded to a stop near the excavation site, and a man stepped out before the engine fully died. He was tall, perhaps 58 or 60, with broad shoulders and the leathery skin of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. His silver-streaked hair was cut short, practical, and his posture carried a rigidity that spoke of military service or hard physical labor. But it was his eyes that caught Ellie's attention. Intense blue, filled with a kind of urgent desperation. He strode directly toward them, his gaze fixed on the exposed steel door. His expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, Ellie realized, but recognition. "You need to stop right now." His voice was deep, rough-edged but controlled, the kind of tone that expected obedience. Ellie stepped forward, squaring her shoulders. At 5'6", she had to look up at him, but years of fighting for respect in male-dominated business meetings had taught her to claim her space. "This is my property. I don't know who you are, but you need to leave." "My name is Thomas Garrett," he said, his jaw tightening. "I've lived in this area my entire life. And that door you just uncovered," he nodded toward the pit, "it's not yours to open." Ellie felt her patience fracture. "I own this land, everything on it, everything under it. That makes this door mine." Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. If you open that door, people will die. Not might die, will die, and their fate will be on your hands." The words hung in the air like both threat and warning. Ellie's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. Rusty stood beside her, unusually quiet, watching Thomas intently. "Then maybe you should explain what I'm dealing with," she said evenly, "because right now you're trespassing on a construction site." Thomas looked at the door, then back at her, and for the first time she saw something beyond anger in his eyes. Desperation. "That door protects people who have nowhere else to go," he said quietly. "People who trusted this place to keep them safe. If you expose it, you'll destroy the only refuge they have. And once it's gone, there's no getting it back." Ellie studied Thomas, trying to read the man behind the warning. His hands were calloused, the kind that came from years of physical work. There was dirt under his fingernails. A carpenter, maybe, or a laborer. Someone who knew this land better than she ever would. But his eyes carried something deeper than rural familiarity. They carried the weight of secrets kept too long, and the fear of what happens when secrets break open. She needed to know what he was protecting, but every instinct told her that once she knew, there would be no walking away from it. "What kind of refuge?" Ellie kept her voice steady, refusing to show the unease spreading through her chest. Thomas glanced at the construction workers standing near their equipment, clearly listening. "Not here. If you want answers, we talk alone." She considered refusing, asserting control over her own property, her own project, but the desperation in his voice had been real, and real desperation usually came from real consequences. "Dave," she called to the foreman, "take an early lunch break. Give us 30 minutes. Dave looked relieved to step away from whatever tension was building between her and the stranger. He nodded and gestured to his crew, who quickly dispersed toward their vehicles. Thomas waited until the workers were out of earshot before speaking. "This land has been a safe haven for over 40 years. People come here when they have nowhere else to run. Women fleeing dangerous situations. Families escaping threats they can't fight. People who need to disappear for a while until it's safe to surface again. He took a breath, watching her reaction carefully. That door leads to a shelter underground, stocked with supplies, beds, medical basics. It's saved more lives than you can count. Ellie felt the information settle like a stone in her stomach. You're telling me there's an illegal hideout under my property? Thomas's expression hardened. I'm telling you there's a lifeline under your property, and if you expose it, you'll cut that line for everyone depending on it. Ellie walked to the edge of the pit, staring down at the steel surface. A memory flashed unbidden, her own hands trembling as she packed a suitcase 15 years ago, her eyes swollen shut, her daughter sleeping in the next room. She had planned to leave that night, but in the end, it was her husband who walked out, not before leaving her with a fractured rib and a lifetime of looking over her shoulder. How many people are down there right now? She asked quietly. Thomas hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. There are people inside right now. The realization hit her with sudden clarity. Her project was sitting on top of an occupied shelter, and she hadn't known, hadn't suspected. The survey had been clean, the title had been clear, but none of that paperwork had mentioned the human lives existing 4 feet below ground level. I have investors waiting on this development, she said, hearing how hollow the words sounded against what Thomas had just revealed. Contracts, deadlines. If I don't move forward, I lose everything I've worked for. Thomas didn't flinch. Then you'll lose everything you've worked for. But at least you won't lose it by destroying people who are already broken. Ellie felt her wrist unconsciously, where a thin scar remained from that last night with her husband. She looked at Thomas, at the steel door, at Rusty, who had somehow known what was beneath the surface all along. The dog whined softly, as if sensing the weight of the decision forming in her mind. I want to see it, she said finally. Show me what's down there. Have you ever discovered something unexpected that changed your entire perspective? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories. The steel door opened with the sound of a vault unlocking. Heavy mechanisms slid into place with the precision of something maintained regularly. Thomas descended first, his movements practiced and familiar, like a man who had made this journey countless times. Rusty followed without hesitation, his tail low but wagging slightly, a sign of caution mixed with curiosity. Ellie went last, her hands finding metal rungs set into concrete walls. The air changed as they moved deeper, cooler, damper, carrying the faint smell of earth and something else she couldn't identify. Lamp oil, perhaps, or the subtle scent of long-term habitation. The ladder dropped 15 feet before opening into a corridor carved from packed earth and reinforced with timber beams. Electric lanterns hung at intervals, their glow steady and warm. Someone had wired this place properly. Someone had built it to last. The corridor stretched ahead, wider than she'd expected, tall enough to walk upright without stooping. Doors lined both sides, some open to reveal small rooms with cots and blankets, others closed. Ellie counted 6 rooms in the first section alone, each one simple but functional. A larger space opened to their right, set up like a common area with a table, chairs, and shelves stocked with preserved food and medical supplies. This wasn't a temporary hideout. This was infrastructure. Decades of planning and maintenance had gone into creating something that could sustain multiple people for extended periods. A young woman appeared from one of the side rooms, freezing when she saw Ellie. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had olive skin and tired eyes that widened with something between fear and panic. A small boy of about 6 clung to her side, half hidden behind her legs, his eyes huge and watchful. It's all right, Rebecca, Thomas said gently, raising a hand. She's the new owner. She needed to see. The woman named Rebecca didn't relax. Her grip on her son tightened, and Ellie could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. The assessment of threat, the measurement of distance to the exit, the preparation to run if necessary. How long have you been here? Ellie kept her voice quiet, non-threatening, the way someone might approach a wounded animal. Rebecca glanced at Thomas before answering. 3 weeks. We needed somewhere safe while things get sorted. The boy hadn't made a sound. He watched Ellie with the kind of stillness that came from learning early to stay quiet. Then his gaze shifted to Rusty, and something changed in his expression, a tiny spark of childlike interest breaking through the wariness. Ellie knelt to be at the child's eye level. This is Rusty. He's very gentle. Would you like to pet him? The boy looked up at his mother questioningly. After a moment's hesitation, Rebecca nodded. It's okay, Jason. Rusty, sensing his role, sat patiently as the child tentatively reached out to touch his golden fur. The dog responded by leaning gently into the touch. A smile, small but genuine, flickered across Jason's face. It was the first time he'd shown any expression at all. He hasn't smiled in weeks, Rebecca whispered, and Ellie noticed the fading bruise at her temple, partially hidden by her hair. Thomas gestured further down the corridor. There are 4 others currently sheltered, 2 women, 1 older man, and a teenager. All of them here because staying where they were meant danger or worse. Some stay a few days, some stay months. We don't ask questions. We just provide a place where they can breathe without looking over their shoulder. Ellie walked further into the shelter, passing another room where an older woman sat on a cot, mending a torn piece of fabric. The woman looked up, nodded once, and returned to her work without speaking. The silence in this place wasn't empty. It was loaded with the kind of quiet that came from people who had learned that noise drew attention, and attention brought consequences. As they walked, Ellie noticed a small collection of photographs tacked to a bulletin board in the common area. Most were recent, showing people she didn't recognize, presumably former residents who had found their way to better circumstances. But one older photo caught her eye. A woman with auburn hair stood next to a younger woman with familiar features. Ellie moved closer, her heart suddenly racing. The younger woman looked eerily like Ellie's mother in her youth. That was taken about 30 years ago, Thomas said, noticing her interest. Some of the first people who passed through here. The younger woman, Ellie said, her voice tight. She looks like my mother. Thomas studied the photo, then Ellie's face. What was your mother's maiden name? Pearson. Margaret Pearson. Thomas's expression shifted. I'd have to check the old log books, but I remember that name. My father mentioned a Pearson woman who stayed here with her young daughter for a while. Ellie stared at the photo, pieces of her childhood suddenly realigning. The unexplained 3-month vacation when she was 7, the nighttime drive away from their home, the basement room where she and her mother had stayed with friends her father couldn't know about. I was here, she whispered. We were here. How do you keep the secret? Ellie asked, turning back to Thomas, still reeling from the discovery. How does an entire shelter exist without anyone knowing? Thomas leaned against the corridor wall, arms crossed. People know, the ones who need to know, the ones who might need it someday. But it stays quiet because everyone who benefits from it understands what happens if it gets exposed. It stops being safe. It stops being an option. And then people die because they have nowhere left to run. Rebecca had allowed Jason to sit on the floor with Rusty now. The dog had laid down, placing his head on his paws, and the boy was carefully stroking his back. It was such a normal, peaceful moment in a place built on fear and desperation. I was a prosecutor's wife, Rebecca said suddenly, her voice low but clear. Nobody believed me when I said what was happening behind closed doors. Who would? He put people in jail for a living. He was respected, admired, But at home, she trailed off, absently touching the bruise on her temple. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, he used every legal means at his disposal to hunt us down. If someone hadn't connected me with Thomas, I don't know what would have happened. Ellie felt a knot form in her throat. I understand, she said quietly. More than you know. She turned away, moving back toward the entrance, toward the ladder leading up to her construction site, her permits, her investors waiting for progress reports. She'd come down here to see what stood in the way of her project. She'd found something that couldn't be measured in timelines or profit margins, and somehow, inexplicably, a piece of her own history she'd never fully understood. Rebecca was watching her from across the common area, that child now sitting contentedly with Rusty, and Ellie realized she was being evaluated just as much as she was evaluating. Could this woman with expensive clothes and development plans be trusted? Or was she just another threat in a long line of threats that had driven Rebecca underground in the first place? The question wasn't whether Ellie could demolish this place. She had the legal right, the equipment, and the motivation. The question was whether she could live with herself after doing it. And standing in that corridor, surrounded by people who had nothing left except this hidden sanctuary, a sanctuary that had once protected her own mother, and by extension, herself, she wasn't sure she knew the answer anymore. Ellie climbed back up the ladder into daylight that felt too harsh after the dimness below. The construction site looked exactly as it had 30 minutes ago, but everything had shifted in ways she couldn't reconcile with the plans rolled up in her truck. Her crew was gathered near their equipment, drinking coffee and avoiding eye contact with Thomas, who emerged behind her and closed the steel door with careful precision. She watched him cover it again with loose dirt, disguising its presence with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to count. The farmhouse demolition could continue, he said without looking at her. Just leave the area around the door untouched. Ellie felt anger flare, hot and immediate. You think I'm going to build around a secret shelter? You think my investors will accept that? Thomas straightened, meeting her eyes with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't hostility either. I think you're going to do what you can live with. And I think you already know what that is, even if you're not ready to admit it yet. She wanted to argue, to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her expectations. But the sound of an approaching car made them both turn. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up, its polished surface almost obscenely out of place among the dusty work vehicles. Richard Harrison stepped out, tall, distinguished, with silver hair perfectly styled, and a tailored suit that probably cost more than Ellie's monthly mortgage. At 60, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no. Ellie, he called, striding toward them with the purposeful walk of someone used to commanding rooms. I was in the area and thought I'd check on progress. Seems like things are moving along nicely. Richard was her lead investor, the man whose money was funding this entire development, and whose patience was already wearing thin after two previous projects had fallen through. His smile was warm, but his eyes were calculating as they moved from the partially demolished farmhouse to the patch of freshly disturbed earth that Thomas had just covered. What's happening over there? He asked, nodding toward the hidden door. We hit some infrastructure issues, Ellie said, the lie coming easily. Nothing serious, just working through the details. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Infrastructure issues weren't in the survey. Old properties like this always have surprises, Thomas interjected, his tone casual but his posture tense. I'm the local contractor Ms. Sullivan brought in to consult. Richard barely acknowledged him with a nod before turning back to Ellie. We need to stay on schedule. The timeline you submitted is already tight. Any delays could jeopardize our entire investment structure. I understand, Ellie said, forcing a smile. We'll make it work. See that you do. Richard checked his watch, an ostentatious timepiece that gleamed in the sunlight. I have a meeting back in town. I'll expect an updated progress report by tomorrow. As he walked back to his car, Ellie felt a chill despite the warm autumn air. Richard Harrison wasn't just her investor, he was her lifeline to completing this project, to securing her future, to proving she could succeed in a world that had tried repeatedly to push her down. And now she was lying to him. What would you do if faced with a choice between professional success and protecting vulnerable people? Have you ever had to make a difficult ethical decision that could cost you everything you've worked for? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I need some time to think, she said to Thomas once Richard had driven away. This isn't a simple decision. There are lives at stake, Thomas reminded her quietly. Take all the time you need, but remember what's underneath our feet right now. Ellie spent that night at the small hotel in town, staring at architectural plans that suddenly felt like lies. The development she'd designed looked clean and profitable on paper, all projected revenue and investor returns. But nowhere in those neat diagrams was there space for the reality of what lay beneath the property. As darkness fell, she found herself driving back to the farmhouse. The construction site was deserted, lit only by moonlight and the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the rural Montana sky. She sat on the hood of her truck, Rusty beside her, staring at the patch of earth that concealed the steel door. The sound of approaching footsteps didn't startle her. Somehow she'd known Thomas would come back too. Couldn't sleep? He asked, leaning against the truck beside her. How could I? She shook her head. Every time I close my eyes, I see that little boy, Jason, the way he looked at me, like I was just another adult who could hurt him. She paused. And now I find out my mother and I were here once, that this place might have saved us too. Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. My grandfather built that shelter during harder times, back when people needed places to disappear and asking questions got you killed. He maintained it until my father took over. Then it became mine. 3 generations of my family keeping that door hidden and those people safe. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself against the night chill. How many people have passed through? Too many to count. Hundreds probably. Some stayed a few days, others stayed months. One woman lived down there for almost a year while things got sorted. She left eventually, started over somewhere new. He paused, then added, Last I heard, she was running a business 2 territories over, doing well, living free. That's what the shelter gives people. Time to heal, space to plan, a chance to become something other than a victim. Ellie felt something stir inside her, a recognition, a memory of her own desperate plans to escape. If her mother hadn't had a place like this to go. I found something today, she said suddenly, reaching into her pocket. While I was looking through the property records, she handed him a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Thomas unfolded it carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. Harrison Development acquired the Harper property yesterday in a private sale. The company plans to assess the land for future opportunities, he read aloud. He looked up, confused. This is from 20 years ago. Richard Harrison owned this land before, Ellie confirmed. He sold it 5 years later to a holding company, which left it sitting untouched until I bought it at auction 2 months ago. Why would he sell it, then finance me to develop it 2 decades later? Thomas stared at the clipping, his expression darkening. I remember now. There was talk back then about a resort development. Nothing came of it. The project was abandoned suddenly with no explanation. Why would he walk away from a valuable piece of land? Ellie pressed. And why would he be so invested in my development now? Thomas folded the clipping carefully and handed it back. I don't know, but I don't believe in coincidences. Not with this much money involved. As Ellie drove back to the hotel, her mind raced with questions. She had built her career on being decisive, on seeing opportunities others missed, and executing without hesitation. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jason's watchful face, Rebecca's fading bruise, the quiet dignity of people who had lost everything except their lives. Sleep didn't come. At dawn, she found herself combing through old newspaper archives at the local library, searching for any mention of Richard Harrison in the Harper property. The librarian, a woman in her 70s named Martha, watched curiously as Ellie piled old newspaper binders on the research table. "You're interested in the old Harper place?" Martha asked, bringing Ellie a cup of coffee. "That land's seen its share of stories. I'm trying to understand why Richard Harrison would buy it, then sell it, then finance someone else to develop it 20 years later," Ellie explained. Martha's expression changed subtly. "Richard Harrison," she repeated, her tone careful. "Now there's a name that carries weight around here." "You know him?" The older woman hesitated. "Everyone knows Richard in Pinewood. He's our biggest employer, biggest donor to the hospital, biggest everything. But 20 years ago," she trailed off, glancing around as if checking who might be listening. "His wife disappeared around that time. Catherine. Lovely woman. There was talk." "What kind of talk?" Ellie pressed gently. "The kind that doesn't get printed in papers," Martha said quietly. "The kind that follows powerful men who wear expensive watches and whose wives have accidents at home." Ellie felt her heart rate quicken. "Did Catherine have accidents?" Martha nodded slowly. "More than most. And then one day, she was just gone. Richard said she left him for another man. No one ever saw her again." By the time Ellie returned to the construction site, the morning sun was climbing higher, and her crew was assembled, waiting for instructions. Dave approached her truck as she pulled up. "Miss Sullivan, we need direction," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "Do we continue demolition or not? The guys are confused after yesterday." Before Ellie could answer, she saw Thomas's blue truck pull up. He wasn't alone. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat, Jason on her lap. The sight of them outside the shelter sent a jolt of alarm through Ellie. "Dave, give me a few minutes," she said, hurrying toward Thomas's truck. "What are they doing up here?" she demanded as Thomas stepped out. "It's not safe for them to be exposed like this." "It wasn't my idea," Thomas replied grimly. "Richard Harrison's car was spotted heading this way. Rebecca insisted on coming. Said she had something important to tell you before you made your decision." Rebecca emerged from the truck, keeping Jason close. "Miss Sullivan, I need to show you something." She handed Ellie a photograph, an older, slightly faded image of a woman with auburn hair and a tentative smile. The woman's eyes seemed familiar somehow, haunted yet determined. "This is Catherine Harrison," Rebecca said quietly, "Richard's first wife. She stayed in the shelter 16 years ago. She's the reason I knew about it when I needed to escape." Ellie stared at the photograph, pieces falling into place. "Catherine, she survived," Rebecca nodded. "She's living under a different name now in Oregon. She runs a support network for women fleeing domestic violence. She was the one who connected me with Thomas when I needed help." "And Richard never found her," Ellie murmured, studying the photograph. "The shelter saved her life," Rebecca said firmly. "Just like it's saving mine. And Jason's." The sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Richard's black Mercedes pulled up, followed by two identical sedans. Richard stepped out, accompanied by four men in suits who had the unmistakable bearing of lawyers or security, perhaps both. His expression darkened when he saw Rebecca standing beside Ellie. His gaze moved to Jason, then to Thomas, and finally settled on Ellie with cold anger. "What's going on here, Ellie?" he demanded, striding forward. "You were supposed to send me an update by now, and instead I find my development site at a standstill." "Your development site," Ellie repeated, emphasizing the possessive. Richard waved a hand dismissively. "Figure of speech. Now who are these people, and why has work stopped?" Rebecca had stepped behind Thomas, keeping Jason shielded, But at Richard's words, she moved forward, her face pale but determined. "He knows exactly who I am," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Don't you, Mr. Harrison? Catherine told me all about you." Richard froze. For a fraction of a second, his polished facade cracked, revealing something ugly beneath. Then just as quickly, his composure returned. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said smoothly, turning to Ellie. "Ms. Sullivan, we have a contract. Either work resumes immediately, or I'll be forced to initiate proceedings for breach. After that, you're liable for all invested capital plus penalties." One of the lawyers stepped forward, tablet in hand. "We've reviewed the contracts. You have 48 hours to begin active construction, or we initiate legal action. The financial penalties would be substantial." Ellie looked at the exposed steel door, at Rebecca and Jason, at Thomas standing protectively nearby, at Richard and his wall of legal firepower. 48 hours to choose who she was going to become. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not moving forward with the development. Not on this site." Richard's face hardened. "You're making a massive mistake." "Probably," she nodded slowly, "but it's my mistake to make. And I'd rather be broke and wrong than responsible for what happens to these people if that door stops existing." "You have no idea what you're doing," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "That shelter should have been destroyed 20 years ago. It harbors criminals, people fleeing legal proceedings, women violating custody arrangements." "Women fleeing men like you," Rebecca interjected, her voice stronger now. "Catherine told me everything, Mr. Harrison, about the broken ribs, the accidental fall down the stairs, how you convinced the local doctor to look the other way." Richard turned to her, his expression now openly menacing. "You should be careful making accusations without proof, especially when you kidnapped your son from his father." "I didn't kidnap him," Rebecca shot back. "I saved him. Just like Catherine saved herself from you." Richard's face flushed with anger. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Where is Catherine?" "Safe," Thomas said simply. "Beyond your reach, just like Rebecca and Jason will be." Richard turned to his lawyers. "This is over. File the breach of contract paperwork today. I want the full penalty amount plus damages." To Ellie, he added, "You've just destroyed your career for nothing. I'll own this land within a month, and that door will be gone forever." As they drove away, Ellie felt the weight of what she'd just done settle over her. She'd chosen, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. But when she looked at Rebecca, at the relief breaking across that young woman's face, at Jason actually smiling as he played with Rusty in the autumn sunshine, she thought maybe she could. The lawsuit arrived 3 days later, delivered to the small hotel where Ellie was still staying. The legal documents were thick and precise, outlining every clause she'd violated, every timeline she'd missed, every dollar Richard Harrison intended to extract from her failed business. $250,000 plus legal fees and penalties, money that might as well have been $1 million for all the chance she had of paying it. Thomas found her that evening, sitting on a bench outside the hotel, Rusty at her feet. He brought coffee in a thermos and sat beside her without speaking for several minutes. "You could fight it," he finally said. "Hire a lawyer. Drag it out." Ellie shook her head. "With what money? I'm broke, Thomas. Everything I had was tied up in that development. My equipment's been repossessed. My crew moved on to other jobs. And in about 3 weeks, Richard's lawyers will own anything I haven't already lost." He leaned back, studying her with that quiet intensity she'd come to recognize. "So, what are you going to do?" She laughed, bitter and tired. "I have no idea. Go back to working for someone else, I guess. Start over at 52. Spend the next decade paying off debt from a project that never happened because I chose conscience over common sense." The words sounded defeated even to her own ears, but she couldn't find the energy to pretend otherwise. She'd made her choice. she'd stand by it. But that didn't make the consequences any easier to swallow. Thomas pulled a folder from his jacket and set it on the bench between them. I've been asking around, talking to people who've used the shelter over the years, people who got back on their feet, built new lives, made something of themselves after they left. Ellie looked at the folder without touching it. Why? Because they want to help. When I told them what you did, what you gave up to keep that door protected, they started reaching out. She opened the folder and saw a stack of envelopes. Some contained small amounts of cash, $20 here, $50 there. Others held checks, but what caught her eye were the notes attached to each contribution. For the woman who saved a place she never knew she needed. From someone you protected without ever meeting. Because 40 years ago, this shelter saved my life, and now you've saved it. The amounts were modest individually, but together they represented something larger than money. They represented every life that had been sheltered in that underground sanctuary. It won't be enough to pay off Richard, Ellie said quietly. Thomas shook his head. No, but it might be enough to start something different. He pointed toward the rolling hills where the Harper farmhouse stood. That property still belongs to you until the lawsuit settles. What if we turned it into something legitimate? Not a development, a sanctuary, official, legal, a place where people can come when they need help. Ellie met his eyes, seeing the beginning of an idea forming between them. What are you suggesting? A transitional housing center, he said, leaning forward eagerly. Partner with domestic violence organizations. Get grants, nonprofit status. Make it sustainable. You've got the land. You've got the skills to manage a project. And now you've got a reputation as someone who will fight for people who can't fight for themselves. Ellie felt the possibility settle into her chest, fragile and uncertain, but real. It would take time, money she didn't have, support from a community she barely knew. But it was a path forward that didn't require her to become someone she'd hate. 2 weeks later, Ellie stood in the county courthouse, facing Richard Harrison across the aisle. Her lawyer, paid for by the growing fund from shelter survivors, had advised her that their chances were slim. Richard had the law on his side. She had breached the contract. The best they could hope for was to reduce the damages. But as the judge entered the courtroom, Ellie noticed something unexpected. The gallery behind her was filling up with people she didn't recognize. Men and women of various ages, some well-dressed, others in simple work clothes. Thomas sat among them, nodding encouragement. The proceedings began with Richard's attorney presenting a damning case for breach of contract. The timeline violations, the failure to perform, the financial damages his client had suffered, it was all accurate and devastating. Then her lawyer called Thomas to testify. He walked to the witness stand and, under oath, told the truth about the shelter, its history, the lives it had saved, and what Ellie had sacrificed to protect it. Next came Rebecca, composed and articulate as she described what the shelter meant, not in abstract terms, but in concrete reality. The bruises that had healed there. The fear that had slowly dissolved into something like hope. The chance to rebuild that she wouldn't have had anywhere else. Richard's attorney objected twice, arguing relevance, but the judge overruled both times and let Rebecca speak. As the testimony continued, an older woman entered the courtroom and took a seat in the back row. There was something familiar about her auburn hair, now streaked with gray, and her watchful eyes. Richard's back stiffened, and Ellie knew, somehow, impossibly, that Catherine Harrison had returned to Pinewood. When Catherine took the stand, a murmur ran through the courtroom. She spoke quietly but with unwavering clarity about the years of abuse she had endured, the night she had finally escaped, and how the shelter beneath the Harper farm had saved her life. If that sanctuary hadn't existed, I would have died, she stated simply, either by my own hand or his. Instead, I rebuilt my life. I've helped hundreds of other women do the same. And now I run a nonprofit foundation with $1 million annual budget dedicated to helping domestic violence survivors. She looked directly at Richard for the first time. I came back today because Eleanor Sullivan did what no one else in this town was willing to do 16 years ago. Stand up to a powerful man and say no more. Richard's face drained of color as he stared at the woman he had once believed gone forever. His hands gripped the table in front of him so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath as husband and wife locked eyes across the space. One powerful and diminished, the other once victimized but now strong. When the judge called Ellie to approach, she stood, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment. Your Honor, I violated the contract. That's true. I failed to meet the timeline. Also true. But I did it because destroying that shelter would have meant destroying the safety of real people with real names and real lives. She took a deep breath. I'm not asking to be excused from consequences. I'm just asking that the court understand why I made the choice I did. The judge nodded slowly, made a note, and called for a brief recess. 30 minutes stretched into what felt like days. When court reconvened, the judge delivered her ruling with the efficiency of someone who had already decided. The breach of contract is clear. However, the circumstances surrounding that breach involve significant humanitarian considerations. I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff regarding financial damages, but reducing the amount to actual losses rather than projected profits. Ms. Sullivan will retain ownership of the property provided she establishes the proposed transitional housing center within 6 months and maintains its operation for a minimum of 5 years. Failure to do so will result in transfer of the property to the plaintiff. Court adjourned. Ellie felt the air rush back into her lungs. She'd lost the lawsuit but kept the land. She owed Richard $75,000 instead of $250,000. Still a massive debt, but one she might actually survive. And she had 6 months to build something real from the choice she'd made. Richard stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked past her without a word. But as he reached the door, he paused. This isn't over, he said quietly, then disappeared into the hallway. Outside, Thomas was waiting on the courthouse steps. Rebecca stood beside him, Jason holding her hand. Catherine Harrison approached Ellie, extending her hand. Thank you, she said simply. Ellie shook her head. I didn't do anything special. You stood up when it would have been easier to look away, Catherine replied. That's always special. She pressed a business card into Ellie's hand. My foundation would be interested in helping fund your transitional housing center. Others approached too, people Ellie didn't recognize but who clearly knew about the shelter, about what it meant, about what she'd fought to preserve. An older woman pressed an envelope into her hand. For the new sanctuary, so others can have what I had. A man in work clothes nodded as he passed. You did right. 6 months later, Ellie stood on the newly built porch of what had once been the Harper Farmhouse. The original structure had been carefully preserved and renovated, its weathered siding replaced, its sagging porch rebuilt, its broken windows restored. Behind it, a new building housed the Pinewood Transitional Living Center, 8 apartments for those in need of temporary shelter, offices for counselors and case managers, a bright common room where weekly support groups met. The steel door remained, hidden and protected, a last resort for those in the most desperate circumstances. But now there was also a front door, open and welcoming, where people could come directly for help without needing to disappear completely. Thomas joined her on the porch, handing her a cup of coffee. First resident moves in tomorrow, he said, a note of pride in his voice. He had overseen much of the construction, volunteering his time and expertise while Ellie navigated the complex world of nonprofit management. I still can't believe we pulled this off, she admitted, watching Rusty play with Jason in the yard. The boy was talking now, short, simple sentences that emerged more frequently each week. His laughter as he threw a ball for the old dog was perhaps the sweetest sound Ellie had ever heard. Rebecca had stayed in Pinewood, taking a job at the local library while she worked toward a degree in social work. She would be the center's first paid staff member once her training was complete. You know, Thomas said thoughtfully, when my grandfather built that shelter, he told my father it would save lives. When my father passed it to me, he said the same thing. Neither of them could have imagined this, something that doesn't just hide people, but helps them rebuild. Ellie nodded, feeling the weight of the journey that had brought her here. She was broke, in debt, and facing the hardest project of her life. The quarterly payments to Richard Harrison would continue for years. Her dreams of developing luxury homes had given way to grant applications and donor meetings. But as she watched the sun setting over the rolling Montana landscape, Rusty and Jason playing in its golden light, she knew she had found something that couldn't be measured in profit margins or investor returns. She had found purpose, and perhaps in this small community that had rallied around her most difficult decision, a home. I made the right choice, she said quietly. Thomas's hand found hers, warm and calloused. You made the only choice you could live with. That's always the right one. Life often presents us with unexpected crossroads where we must choose between practical success and deeper values. Has there ever been a moment when you chose the harder but more meaningful path? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage and redemption.